So some people ask me, how long does the restoration phase last? How long does it take to decompose the entire embodied stress? So we talked about this metaphor before, right? Borrowing money from the bank and giving it back without interest. Basically, the premises is when you borrow money, you have to pay back the exact same amount. So when we take a look at the two phases, all what is red needs to be compensated with blue. So everything that is in the adaptation phase needs to be paid back into the restoration phase. If you look really careful, there's also redness in the healing crisis. Correct, which is also red. So actually the adaptation phase, the energy being embodied there, the embodied stress plus the embodied stress during the healing crisis, needs to be paid back during the restoration and the normalization phase. So if I run 40 miles, I need 40 miles of rest. If I run 5 minutes, I only need 5 minutes of rest. If I party for 40 hours, I need to rest enough to compensate for the 48 hours. Does this make any sense? So for example, this situation, I borrowed 20 coins in the adaptation phase. I need to pay them back in the restoration phase. And this is the most simple model. I borrow 12 and I pay back 12. However, I could borrow 12 and pay back 3 times 4, which takes a little bit longer, but I have to give less money to the bank each week. But I'm in the process of paying back for longer time. So I have longer symptoms, longer time I will be in the restoration phase, but I will have less symptoms. We can even extend that further by paying only 3 coins back a week. Now the process lasts for 4 weeks, but I only have to pay 3, which might be easier to do than paying 4 or 6. So the symptoms are less intense, but the process will last longer. I can also decide to pay it back much sooner. However, I have to invest a lot more money to pay back to the bank, but then my process of paying back is shorter. And the final situation is if I'm re-triggered, I borrow 12, I pay back 6, I borrow another 2, now I have to pay back 6 and 2, 8. So this really clarifies that if you're running a process and you're intercepting the payback, you intercept the restoration phase, you still need to pay back any other amount. And if you're being re-triggered, it is kind of borrowing more money from the bank, which you need to pay back. So these 5 examples, these 5 situations show different ways how you can pay back and how you can influence the restoration phase. By paying back more, you shorten it, and by paying back less, you increase it. By paying back more, you shorten it, but the symptoms will be deeper, symptoms will be more, you'll have to invest more, and when you're extending the restoration phase, you have to pay back less each week. The symptoms will be prolonged, but the symptoms will be less intense. And the conclusion is always you have to pay back what you borrowed. You cannot really get a shortcut because you need to pay back everything that you borrowed. Okay, take a look at the following video clip. That's what happens in nature. You cannot cut the healing short. You need to let nature run its course to a certain extent. You can modulate a little bit, but you need to know what you're doing, right? The time for the restoration is roughly half of the adaptation phase. The entire healing phases, so the restoration, healing crisis, and normalization phase, the entire blue area is about roughly the same time as the adaptation phase. So if the adaptation phase is like 4 weeks, the restoration, healing crisis, normalization also takes about 4 weeks. It's roughly the same. So the restoration, the darker blue area, is roughly only half of the adaptation phase. So if the adaptation phase is like 3 weeks, the first part, the restoration phase, is about a week and a half. It's about roughly half. However, there are some exceptions to that. It is maxed to 3 weeks. The restoration phase is maxed to 3 weeks. A lot of people don't notice, but there's a max of the restoration phase to 3 weeks, and then there's a healing crisis, and then there might be another restoration phase, right? So if there's a 1 week adaptation phase, we have about roughly 3.5, 4 days of restoration. If we have 2 weeks of adaptation, we have roughly a week of restoration. If we have 6 weeks of adaptation, 6 weeks of intense stress, bodies in adaptation, we have 3 weeks of restoration. If we have 8 weeks of adaptation, we have 3 weeks of restoration. Also 3 weeks of restoration. So we get into intense restoration phase, then we have a healing crisis, and then we have another restoration phase. But the healing crisis is not always noticed. However, these examples are only if the person is not re-triggered anywhere in the middle. So just to know, the restoration phase is roughly half of the adaptation phase, but max to 3 weeks.
Now go to free.biocompass.org and get more additional resources, all free.